Good evening. Okay, the microphone is working. Good. My name is Christian Jewell and I'm the manager of the Asia Pacific Design Library here at State Library of Queensland. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners on the land that we gather tonight, the Turrbal and Yugara people, and pay respects to their ancestors that came before them. I'd like to welcome you to the second lecture in our UQ Architecture Lecture Series. We're very excited to welcome Peter Besley from Assemblage. Before we start, I need to remind you, if you have your mobile phone, can you please switch it to silent or switch it off? But we also encourage you to follow the conversation on Twitter using the hashtag APDL lecture. We're also recording tonight's lecture for our Design Online website, and there'll be questions at the end. If you don't want your voice used in those questions, you can let us know. We also have bathrooms on level 2 and 3, and the exits are signed. So the Asia Pacific Design Library is a shared space for industry, academia and the public to come together around design in the Asia Pacific. Two of our key components that we're promoting at the moment is our website Design Online, where we have an article and documentation of these lectures available every Monday afternoon. So you'll find an article and resources from Peter's talk on that site next week. We're also selling the Design Offline Journal, which is a journal designed to support your note-taking and further learning for lectures, and that's available for sale from the library shop. Anyway, I'd like to introduce Tim O'Rourke from UQ to welcome Peter Besley for his talk. Thank you.
Good evening, and thanks to the State Library for hosting this event, and to Lewis, who asked me to do this at late notice this afternoon. Now, part of the reason I've been asked to introduce Peter is that I studied with Peter in the late 80s at the University of Queensland, and as a student, Peter was worryingly thoughtful about architecture and also a very good drawer. After the school of leaving the School of Architecture, he worked with Timothy Hill in the very early days of that practice before moving to the UK and working in the practice of Richard Murphy in Edinburgh. After that, I've only got snippets of information from various members of his family. Until, of course, there's been some large press releases. And after that, we're all much better connected to Peter, if somewhat vicariously. So in a typically self-effacing manner, Peter's given us two sentences to work with. And Assemblage, this is a London-based studio of architects and urban designers, active across a broad spectrum of project types ranging from individual objects and buildings to large urban strategies. Launched in 2003, the studio receives commissions from a variety of private and public sector clients in both the UK and the Middle East. Now I'll leave it to Peter to demonstrate why this is such an understated representation of his practice.
I'd like to show two projects tonight. There are other projects to show, but there's just simply not enough time. But I would like to mention them in passing. I think that there's work that we're doing for the UN in terms of social housing in Iraq, which I think is probably the most important work that we're doing at the moment. I know there's been a lot of press about the parliament and so on, but clearly politics doesn't matter much if you don't have a house, it certainly plugs you into the reality of what's required on the ground in a third world country, and also what it really takes to build civic life from the ground up. And they're actually quite unglamorous projects and quite poorly funded projects, often to do with neighbourhoods, to do with houses, quite personal things to do with actual families, to do with schools, things like this. So it's something of an apology. I'm not going to actually talk about some of those tonight, but I think that people are very curious to see the work on the Parliament, but in order to contextualize that a bit, I'm also going to show a project that we're doing in a place called Cadmea in northern Baghdad, which does bring in some of those issues. And also, from a discipline point of view, I'm hoping that I can show you something about the way we approach things, but also to show what urban design is, at least in our minds. I think it's a very different thing to architecture. It does involve a different skill set. It also involves a certain amount of removing yourself and your centrality, if that makes sense, from the process, and allowing a lot of people to come after you to do great swathes of work. And not only is that a permissible thing as a creative gesture, but it's also a great thing that all these other voices can come and inhabit a structure that you've set out, and you're really setting out the North Stars, and they're coming through and following. So in a way, I feel, as an architect, it's been a very maturing thing to learn about urban design and to understand that its social and political connections it actually de-aestheticises a lot of the concerns and actually makes architecture more meaningful. So I'm really in danger of over-talking tonight. I think I've asked somebody to come down about 7:05 to make sure I don't go on forever, because the facility needs to be closed. So I'm sorry if I also go too quickly. So I'm going to start by showing, well, this is Baghdad, obviously. I think that it's quite... the river really reminds me of the Brisbane River in many ways. I think it's and the Thames to a certain extent. It's not like a European river, which is shorter. If you go to France, in Paris, for example, that it's really quite small, the Seine, and so you can hop across. So the districts are quite closely related, like here in Brisbane and also in Baghdad. The different sides of the river have very different characteristics, and that's a part of its charm, but also something to get your head around if you're going to be working in the area. Just to set the scene a little bit, a lot of people don't know anything about Baghdad. They see it on the news and so on. So I just thought I'd tell you my impressions of it. Is that first of all, it's green. And if you're working in the Middle East, the typical images that you have in mind are sort of sand and death, And but Baghdad is actually incredibly green. It has a very high water table, and you've got the Tigris and the Euphrates on the one side, and it means that if you're digging a basement of, say, more than 3 meters, it immediately starts to fill with water. There's a lot of gum trees there. It was hilarious to see that the British actually brought in a whole series of gum trees at that time. So when you're driving around Baghdad, for example, there are trees everywhere. There's grass everywhere. It's very different to being, for example, in Qatar or the UAE, for example, where every drop of water is desalinated. Baghdad is actually a green city, and in fact it's a tragedy because they had the foresight to plant a whole green belt of trees in order to reduce the sandstorms to the point where the buildings themselves can then, through courtyard techniques and so on, get an acceptable standard of living. But there was a fantastic merging of the scale. So at the city scale, they had this beautiful green belt, which then reduced it, which meant then you could open windows and do things at the architectural scale. And then with the invasion in 2003, they completely, in a sort of almost like Vietnam, annihilated the entire green belt because insurgents could be hiding there, such that now they have the worst sandstorms that they've ever had for hundreds of years in Baghdad, and it's also incredibly dirty. That the sand isn't like nice beach sand; it's a sort of dirty sand. It's big. Baghdad is big. It's nearly 8 million people, so nearly twice the size of Sydney. You really get the feeling of a thumping metropolis, not in a sort of first world busy, cappuccino drinking way, but it's a big city and it has its own dynamics inside it. Again, not like the Gulf states, which are, again, Qatar, for example, has a native population of only 250,000. These are very small, with a background of pearl diving. Baghdad has been a very large, ancient city for a long, long time. A bit like London in that it was also a large city and grew very rapidly in the 19th century, but Baghdad was, for example, the biggest Middle Eastern city since the Middle Ages. Another thing I can't actually stress enough is that the infrastructure in Baghdad is just completely destroyed, whether it's a road, because the tanks came in and destroyed the sub-base so that it can only actually take car traffic now. You can't even put HGV sort of trucks over it. There's very little water. The electricity barely works at all. I'm constantly in a meeting there, like it will be in an event like this. All the lights will go out, and people actually just keep talking as if nothing's happening. It's quite surreal, and that might go on for say 4 hours, and then suddenly the lights will come back on again. The other infrastructure that you would expect, like medical infrastructure or the provision of food, just so many basic things are not there at all. And that's not just because of the American invasion in 2003 and Australia as well, is because in the 90s and 80s there was the war with Iran, which just decimated the population, but also it was the sanctions in the 90s which completely removed the middle classes from Baghdad, and anybody with a passport and any money at all left. So you were left with a very tough group of people who either couldn't travel or wouldn't travel because they had vested interests, and that completely changes the demographic of the city. There are a lot of weapons everywhere that you go in Baghdad. There's the office Kalashnikov is on the table, one of many. There's because there are not high street banks as such. There's the Central Bank of Iraq, but it means that all of your savings you keep with you or in your house, and if you're an office or an organisation, that means there's always a large sum of money somewhere, and of course a lot of weapons to protect that, and then of course there is the risk of terrorism there at all times. So it's shocking at first, but you quickly get used to there being weapons everywhere. Some of it's sort of everybody has small arms, but also in the street there are large tanks everywhere. Having said that, though, the Iraqis themselves are incredibly friendly and very funny. Actually, I didn't expect that. They have that whole English as a second language. They play with the language a lot. They're very wry, as you'd expect, because of the conditions, but extremely welcoming. And they, I guess, since ancient times, have a tradition of welcoming strangers, and that's very touching as well. So that's quite unexpected. So just to get your bearings, the centre of town is about. The centre of town is about here, Rusafa, and the airport is sort of off to the left here. The Le Corbusier gymnasium is in this area. This is it finds quite funny is that the university is put at the end of the peninsula here, which really reminds me of here a great deal. And it's even got its sort of Suffragette Drive going down the middle here. And it actually feels very like there must be something, a typology of peninsular universities, I think, which somebody should do a study of. There's the two projects I'm going to talk about tonight. The first one is called Cadmea, which is this little fried egg shape up here. This is the Tigris, of course. And the Parliament, which is here. Zawar Park, which is a bit like the sort of central park of Baghdad, is there, although they don't really have public space in the way that we would recognise it. So this is Baghdad in 1944. I think the first thing you can see is that so much of the expansion has happened in the last 50 years. And here you can see much more of the original pattern. So that there's the centre of town there, which is to do with the medieval walled city. And the Tigris, you can also see this is under the British Mandate. You can see that they've put the railways in. This goes up to Mosul and completely connects the entire country. You've got all of this railway infrastructure coming from the north and from the south here, and terminating at the central railway station, which I'll come to later in terms of the Parliament. I think is very significant that you have this public transport connection, which is right next to the site for the Parliament, and the airport, which is actually the Parliament site now. So this was all in place very early. The other very significant thing is that you can see that Cadmea up there is its own settlement, and it's all based on a Shia shrine. Cadmea is regarded as a holy city in Shia Islam, along with Najaf and Baghdad itself. But the Cadmea are a separate people. They have their own customs and so on. And the shrine actually came first, and the settlement slowly started to pack in around it, as is quite normal. So here you can see, this is just picking out some of the main elements. The reason I've called tonight's talk, Ideas for the City of Peace, the name for Baghdad was the City of Peace, which is of course, bitterly ironic now. But the powerful caliph in the 8th century, Mansur, he built a circular city in just 4 years, as it's shown on the drawing there. And it was an incredible achievement. It was considered paradise at the time, but was also the seat of power for the entire region. And I think as I'll come to it, you'll see the references that we've tried to make in the Parliament project to it, but it's also very significant, I think, that a part of the old circular city comes onto the Parliament site. You can also see hatched there is the old Medinas. The Medinas are sort of the ancient housing stock of the Middle East. In the case of Baghdad, they have a very particular quality. They've got these beautiful 2-story courtyards. I could actually give a separate talk on those houses. I think they actually have radical implications for modern housing, which I'll talk about a little bit, but they were clustered in Rusafa there, and you can see also up in Cadmea. So there's the shrine, and the Tigris in the background. The Tigris is a pretty fascinating river in its own right. You can see the very steep banks there. The Turks are now busy damming it like crazy, so the water level is falling quite a lot because Saddam's not flying his planes over their heads every time they try to do that. So I think the Iraqis are a bit sad about that. But it's still a large river, and it was famous for its floods, a bit like here, I guess. And Cadmea has always had its own relationship to the Tigris, which is slightly different to Baghdad. You can see there that the shape of the Tigris has actually moved very slightly over time with its flooding and the mudflats and so on. And Cadmea was sort of like a little ball tucked into its elbow, but that shape has since changed over time. This is me standing on top of the city wall, of the shrine walls, looking out over the Cadmea houses themselves. You can see the extent of damage and the degradation that happens, I guess, over 30 years of tyranny and also neglect. But this is not a derelict site, this is where people live. And the brief really was in 2 main parts. It was, because it is a holy city in Shia Islam, you get enormous amount of pilgrims even on Friday. I mean, Cadmea itself is, say, 5,000 or 6,000 people in Cadmea itself, but you will find, say, 20,000 people will visit the shrine on a Friday, and then for one of the important religious days, of which there's about 5 or 6 in the year, you will get 1 million people coming into the city. So you can imagine the force of pressure that puts on services such as sewerage, such as water provision and food provision and medical supplies. It's hard to explain when you have a medieval type of city with tiny streets and no vehicle access, and you squeeze like a pressure, like some sort of extruded volume of 1 million people through that. People regularly die there all the time. And so they obviously want to do something about that. And then the other half, which is an interesting half of the project, is to look after the Cadmea itself. What are they doing? What are their needs? What is the local populace needs, not only to survival of the pilgrims, but also what are their local needs? So there's an interesting sort of international edge and then a local edge to this. To give... Oh, actually, I'll come back in a minute. There's the bridge there, down here. I mean, for example, in 2005, there was 950 people died on that bridge, where there was the pilgrims just massing into the city, and there was some bomb scare, which was not actually a bomb, and people then rushed onto the bridge, and a lot of people were pushed into the river, and because the women are not allowed to expose themselves, it means they can't swim, and so the whole of Baghdad was just littered with bodies and children's bodies and so on. And that's a particularly bad instance, but each year you get a high level of death in the city. There's sort of raw sewage running in the streets. Individual households don't have water, so you actually fill up a sort of central thing of water and then take it to your house, which is actually historic, and people would fill a goat skin of water and take it to the house from the Tigris, but nevertheless, and you can see in the last picture there the stream of pilgrims. And I'm painting a pretty grim picture here, but it's also pretty fantastic is that you see, I've been there where part of the pilgrimage tradition is that you have to walk there and you can get your bus or your plane out again. So you'll find, coming to Cadmea, the most incredible, in modern times, to see millions of people walking in out of the desert, covered in sand, and the people, the Cadmiris themselves are actually throwing water on them and cooking food for them. And I've seen whole streets where they have these massive cauldrons which are a couple of meters across with big, like witch-burning fires underneath them, where they're actually feeding everybody en masse as they come in. So I think it's worth remembering that in modern times there are these huge collective movements, collective efforts that have nothing to do with money necessarily, and in this case it's to do with religion, but these phenomena are still possible. This is a mapping of some of the more important historic houses. I'm taking too long, but I'll go a bit more quickly. Is that the historic houses are very interesting in that they are extremely beautiful in themselves. However, they are actually relatively young in terms of conservation. Is that because of the mud brick and also because of the termites there, is that they are, over millennia, they're actually rebuilt in terms of their basic arrangements, not by architects, but by tradition. So the key relationships between the courtyard, the primary rooms, the way that the rooms relate to each other, the way that the house sits in the street, this would have been regularly rebuilt, say, every 100 years. So I find it incredibly fascinating that what you're seeing there is relatively young fabric. They look very old, but they're actually relatively young. But it's actually the invisible relationships between the objects which is the ancient part of it. So in terms of inserting into that, you can actually participate in a tradition of rebuilding, but in an older way. This is just an ollie plan to demonstrate the incredible nature of the Medina. It's actually more solid than void almost, and it has this appearance almost of being like a piece of ceramic with this tentacular little streets and almost like a mazed cracking pattern through something which is otherwise completely solid. And it's also very much the feeling when you're there. So that's a little zoomed into the Medina there. And these are the houses. I'll try not to spend too much time on these, but they are incredible. They are generally about 2-3 stories. One of the things I like most about them is that they are, first of all, they're not about the elevation. The Iraqis don't care at all about what it looks like to the street. It's got nothing to do with elevations. The whole tradition in the West of this is my object as a piece of ownership and also as a sign to the rest of the world about what the person who owns the building stands for. The Iraqis don't give a stuff about that. What only matters is who is allowed to come inside and what the courtyard is like and how beautiful the courtyard is. So it has this fantastic interior world. So you don't end up with a city of facades, effectively. You don't end up with an exterior type of city. It's just an interior world, much of which you don't see unless you're a member of the family or an invited person. The other thing I love about them is that the rooms themselves are completely undesignated. They don't have bedroom, bathroom, kitchen and all this sort of nonsense. They have important rooms which are ornamented in particular ways and have different heights and different characteristics, and then depending on the temperature or the time of year or who's in the house, you will move from different parts of the building to do different things. So that, and you might ask, how does that work with eating and so on? They have these beautiful, huge, flat dishes which sit on these little legs on the ground, so that gets moved to wherever the meal is going to take place, and the beds are rolled up, and you might sleep on the roof depending if it's a cool night, or you might be down in the serdab in the basement if it's cool there. So it has this fantastic dynamic character, and that happens both in section, moving up and down depending on the temperature and the people who are there that day, but also in plan around the courtyard in different rooms. So in this context, the thing that I wanted to point out is that the primary geometry, the one that really counts, is the courtyard, not the elevation. So many Western buildings are designed from the plot inwards. So what happens here is that, I'm trying to show it in the clumsy diagram drawn here, that the pure geometry, in this case a square, is the hosh, is the courtyard. And then the most important room, which is called the Ursi room, relates to the geometry of the hosh, of course. And on the first floor, what happens is that you'll get these beautiful window seats, which then project off the Ursi room, and then you see if you like, the bottoms of those poking out into the street. But what you're seeing in the street, therefore, is not the street geometry. You're actually seeing the geometry of the courtyards inside. So there's this extraordinary, I think, quite moving thing, is that you're experiencing an interior geometry pushed out into the street. And I became very fascinated with this and spent quite a lot of time looking at these houses. So you can see here, that's a window seat, and they're quite grand, some of them. And actually there's a lot of fantastic stories about these. Even though the women live these slightly segregated lives, and they're often higher up in the building, they know exactly what's going on in the courtyard. And because the streets are so close to each other, and the cantilevering window seats come so close together, they then just gossip to each other across the whole city. And so you have all these past messages rapidly passing across the city that never even touch the ground. It's quite fantastic. So this is a photo of me there. This is quite what it's like there. It has this amazingly sort of congested character. You can see on the right? You're right, yes. Is that the households will club together and buy a generator, and it'll put on the corner, and the whole of Baghdad is covered with wires and cables as people try and cope with the lack of electricity. And it almost feels like there's some enormous spider has crawled over the entire city and left these webs everywhere. Half of the wires work, some of them don't. It's completely chaotic. And sometimes they get slightly higher, and of course there are little shops poked into the ground floor. So, moving on a bit, what to do about this actual project? I think if we have a method, which we don't really at Assemblage, I think that the three things I'd say that we do quite a lot. One is that we tend to distrust names. So I think the game's over really if you sit down and decide you're going to design a parliament, or you can design a kitchen, or whatever it is. I think you have to break that down in your mind and say, I'm going to design a platform for democratic interaction, or I'm going to design a way of preparing food, or whatever it is. And because I think so much of the commodification, even of terminology, ambushes architects right at the beginning of the phase. I'd say that's number one. The second thing is that I think briefs are of course important, especially to clients, but once they've been digested and understood, they're almost useless to the architect. All of the big ideas that will drive an urban design or a really great piece of architecture actually have nothing to do with the brief. And I think the other thing is that there are many ideas that you can discover in architecture and urban design that work very powerfully across scales. So you'll learn something about a window, or at the big scale about a transport network, and they will actually inform each other quite strongly. In this case, it was looking at the house and understanding that if you think of all of the program, the uses of the house, it doesn't actually tell you about the courtyard, and yet the courtyard is the most important piece in it. And we took that in this case and ran with it in terms of urban design. And you can see that on the left here, there's a shrine in the middle. We do a lot of diagrams like this generally. It's not really meant for other people, but we do them to clarify the thinking in our own minds. The Medina has this sort of ragged edge around the shrine, and what we wanted to do is, irrespective of all of the substantial program that was required from the brief, is to achieve a space. We thought that was by far the most important thing. And it would have a regular geometry exactly like the houses are. And then the program, which you can see on the far right, where we make a kind of wall building. Sometimes it's a wall, sometimes it thickens to have the ablutions and washing and security and all of these things that is required. It becomes a building, VIP access and so on. So this was actually the key which completely unlocked the project. So what you're seeing there on the right-hand side is a building. It's actually a massive building, but it's also a wall building and defines a space and has niches and staircases and all sorts of ins and outs going on it. And of course you can see the slots in it. The main babs, as they call them, are gates which align to the major routes already coming in and out of Cadmea. In the old days, and in all the Medinas, you'll find that the urban grain comes right up and abuts the landmark buildings, which I find fantastic in a way. It's very different to a kind of Beaux-Arts or where you have grand axes and so on leading up to the great object, whereas here you're going down a tiny little street and then suddenly you come across this enormous object inside it. It's very moving. Unfortunately, in the 1970s, the ragged edge you see there on the left is a Polish company came in, Pol Service, God knows who they are, and actually destroyed some of the most important houses because it was a privilege to be close to the shrine, which were right next to the shrine, before somebody had a sort of better idea and stopped the bulldozers. So what we tried to do in our scheme, this is the master plan, this is the scheme that we presented, is to make a virtue of necessity, and with the wall building, I'm not sure what you'd call it, that element that we've created, is then it is able to do that direct connection to the urban fabric once again. Now, but with its new enlarged space, it's now able to cope with the amount of visitors and so on. I'll come back to this image, but we placed the major chunks of program, which is an enormous library and a mosque and a school, a religious school, and a massive eating area on the left-hand side. Here. Zooming out a bit, and this was not in the brief at all, we were only told to look at the square kilometre of Cadmea. It quickly became apparent to us that the whole area to the southwest was ripe for regeneration, a sort of mixed-use regeneration, which we felt would be the right thing to do, because not only would it help pay for a lot of the work to the historic centre, but it would also then, in the longer term, provide employment and services opportunities to the Cadmea themselves. So we put the two together, and we actually made that an integral part of the scheme. And then, incredibly importantly, you can see down on the bottom left there is we rebuilt a railway station. And my involvement in the London Olympics in 2002, 2003 is that it was very interesting to see that if you really want to move large volumes of people, you need trains. You know, it's cars, buses, boats, anything else just doesn't cut it. You need trains, and the sort of numbers that we're talking about now means trains. And so the whole connection between that railway station and this big piece of work that we're doing in the core had to be emphatic. So we created a whole boulevard, and it's quite fantastic, is that the pilgrims that come in by the millions, is that it's not just sort of, you know, you, me, and my mate John. It's sort of like a couple of thousand people, and they do reenactments as well as part of the religious festivals with horses racing around and people waving swords and things. And so there needs to be a space for that to happen, and so we made this very generous wide boulevard leading, as part of the sequence, leading from the primary railway station all the way to the centre. So this is just removing picking out all of the proposed elements. You can see the long boulevard that we have in mind, which then at the end would actually take people to a higher level above the street. And I'll come to that in a minute, so that there's not this whole crossing between. Really? Okay, I'm going to go much faster. We introduced a necklace of spaces and uses around the shrine in terms of this is addressing the localism of the Cadmea themselves, and also to take some pressure off the centre. And that involved a sort of necklace of squares and uses, which I think would be very beautiful to do, and also have a very strong functional purpose, and that they would bring the ring mains for sewage and power and so on deep into the hearts of the communities, and then radiate them out slowly, because it's just not feasible or practical to think that you're going to bring that to all of the individual households, but we can bring them to the nodes and then radiate them outwards. And then they would take on their own characters over time. They would become, great restaurants or medical services or whatever it is. And then you can see the derelict part of the land to the left, and this is the main pieces of program that we were to provide under the actual brief. And you've got to the top there is a huge library for 50,000 volumes, and the top, what's it? Which is here. And then the school is here. It's all wrapped up in a screen, as you'll see in a minute. And then a large new mosque, and then underneath there is an eating area for 10,000 people. So in elevation and section, conceptually there, we actually made a plinth up at about 7 or 8 meters. And I'll try and make sense of this, but I'll have to be quick. Is that this one we imagined almost like Asplin's library, where you'd have a sort of a top-lit space with this a huge book-lined room, quite formal and quite formally powerful, both on the outside and the inside. But then the actual religious school would have a much more broken down and sort of informalness, and that you would find that the scholars who come from all over Iraq and actually stay on site would sort of be peeking out the top of the screen, and the whole thing would be wrapped up in a kind of a compound. I have to go faster, I'm sorry. And then in terms of the phasing was very important, so we'd go in there and surgically make the space for the building wall. We would then build that with its key gates and so on. And you can see the spaces being created for the necklace. We'd then create the ring main with those necklace spaces, start building our way out, do the big chunky program pieces, and then we'd be finished. So, which looks easier than it is. I love this photograph. I can't quite explain why. It's very like being there. There's something special, I think, about the onlooker actually being in the arch. The Baghdadis have a fantastic tradition of ornamenting with mirrors, which is very peculiar to the year, and that mekanas, that niche space, has a sort of ethereal quality. And the women, when you get that very strong sun and with their black robes and so on, there's a lot of sitting on the ground that goes on. They get this sort of semi-geological look to them as they're sitting on the ground. So that's me there in the evening. It was just too hot for the day with my albino skin. I was getting completely fried, so I tend to come out at night, which is also actually when they come out as well. This is actually the scheme that won the competition. It was a competition at this stage where by a regional company called Dewan, where they've demolished the entire Medina for this, which was very disappointing for us. It was sort of more than a case of you can bring a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. It's more like we were wondering, well, is it a horse, and does it drink water even? And we're pleased to say, though, that scheme over the last 2 years has been completely cancelled, and it's been re-tendered, and we've put together a new consultant team, and we've bidded for that, and so we're expecting to hear that next month, we hope. To move to the Parliament, which is in that site there. Zooming in there, you can see the circle in the middle. There's this massive sort of super mosque that Saddam wanted to build to last 1,000 years. There's a whole lot of projects around Baghdad, including 16 of his palaces. You know, it's shocking actually. These hovels next to these enormous palaces, which is probably the size of the entire South Bank, all squashed together in one building. In this case, it was a super mosque, half built. He was deposed before it could be finished. So we were on site there, wandering around amongst these 60, 70 metre pieces of concrete. We had to wonder what to do with that. We were instructed as part of the competition to use that structure in some way in the new parliament. And we had a lot of head scratching about that, and we decided not to do that because partly it was for insurance reasons, inevitably, is that we don't actually know about the reinforcing. All the documentation was destroyed in the war, so we don't actually know how strong they are, even though they look very strong. But also, much more importantly, I think ideologically, it was very strange, I think, to build a new parliament on the structure of the old regime. So we decided to take them down, and everyone was like, well, how on earth are you going to take them down? And we decided that we would keep the pile cap. It's like London. It's a river city, so we have this huge pile structure underneath this with a massive pile cap. We worked out that we could keep that. And one of the senior engineers at Bureau Apdl, when we were chin-scratching about what to do with these huge columns, simply said, Turkish contractor. Which I thought was, apparently they're complete animals. You just let them off the leash on the site and they'll destroy anything. This is one of the, they would do hundreds of these sort of diagrams. This is one we did for the Parliament where what we tend to try and do is convert the brief or extract from the brief and make it non-verbal, not about words, and we put it into diagrams. In this case, we're looking at, there's an onion skinning of filters really that go down to the site. On the one hand, you've got the Tigris on one side, and then you've got railway lines on the other. But in terms of access, it may as well be the same thing. So it's the bridges that count, and that was allowing us to work out the primary entrances and exits from the site and about where to approach it. Of course, in the end, we put the public entrance from the south, which is where the railway station is and Zawa Park is. So this was actually the proposal. This was this enormous model that we made. It's bigger than a double bed. And let me get my notes because there's a couple of important things to say about this. I think the first thing is that we decided to approach the brief as a piece of urban design rather than as a single architectural object. There's a number of reasons why we did that. One is that we wanted to form it almost as a pattern of streets connecting courtyards. Some of these streets would be internal, some of them would be external, but in the mind they would be a street. We wanted there to be, I guess, like a comfortable fabric. We almost wanted to create a fabric, an urban fabric, which you could then place landmark buildings and landmark uses within it. And we thought that by doing that, the circular building is the House of Representatives, the large square building is the Federal Council, it's a federalised state like Australia, and the little cube there, rotated to Mecca, is the prayer space. But it means that these landmark buildings, along with the fabric, then is a very flexible, very navigable way of getting through actually a huge program. You can imagine this all collected up into one huge mega object, hyper stylized, no doubt, in the current way. It actually becomes incredibly difficult. You end up with tentacular sort of corridors and so on. We want to use the intelligence and the logic of the traditional city to actually unlock this modern program. The other big thing is we had a lot of pragmatic things that we wanted to solve. We wanted it to be easy to build, but also easy to phase. So Kew Gardens came on board with us, and they were very interested. They've been documenting every Iraqi plant since 1975, and the courtyards you see here, we're very ambitious for the courtyard as a thing, rather than the departments around them as such. The departments will be great, of course, but we wanted them to take their identity from the various courtyards, so the legal department or the translation department, whatever it is. Those buildings would then be grouped around the courtyard, and that meant that we could actually build it and phase it very effectively, because we could do them in courtyard clusters until the final building was complete as a complex, as a campus, and that meant that it could be occupied much earlier, years earlier than otherwise possible. It also meant that taking this approach meant that it was possible to daylight and naturally vent so much of the building, which you just can't do with a mono lump. Also, it reflects the program in a bizarre way. Is that people think of parliaments as this singular chamber. However, the reality of parliaments is that they're very hard-working buildings. There's a veritable ant nest of cellular spaces that need to be accommodated. And by taking a more urban approach, we actually are able to have more tools to solve that kind of problem. I'm not going to talk about this because we don't have time. The fabric, as I call it, had a brise soleil, a sunshade about 2 or 3 meters hovering above the roof level, which is the metallic stuff you can see there. And we saw that as a unifying thing, but also as a way of, it's like an architectural elevation in its own right. It was also, if you go to Arabic cities, the roof space is a complete hodgepodge. It's like satellite dishes and garbage and everything, because it rains so infrequently, and water tanks and everything. And we thought that in order to make the roof affordable, they can build whatever they like, and we'll have this brise soleil, which of course will shade the building very well, but it will also bring in an elevation, an aspirational elevation for the whole building. It'll also allow, because it achieves a site datum vertically, it means that the landmark buildings can then start to sing and you see them from afar. So it's doing multiple roles. It also starts to venture across walkways so that they become like the old souks almost, where it's a semi-outdoor street. There's a lot of opportunity for them. Also, 2-story buildings, which is what the fabric is made of, is a very comfortable height. It means that fire and so on doesn't become a problem. It also means that this brise soleil, this horizontal brise soleil, is at tree canopy level, so you get a continuity of shade across the entire site. This is quite a clumsy drawing, but it's quite an important drawing that we did very early, just a sketch, is that it's, okay, bear that one in mind if you can, is that the Parliament itself, it's in terms of ideas incredibly tough. Actually, you have to ask yourself serious questions about modern democracy and transparency if you're going to seriously sit down and design a parliament, which in a way we avoided doing by going, right, I'm going to sit down and design a parliament as an object, because as I said earlier, I think that's exactly what you start to do wrong. But we tried to decide, we decided to approach it as designing a platform, really, not an object. And on that platform, you would make every condition available possible that the correct relationships or the good relationships, a healthy relationship between the represented and the representatives could form. So it's much more like a framework which is then filled by the use of the people. Now, I know that sounds quite abstruse, but it was a very serious undertaking for us. And so in this sketch, for example, it seemed to us the primary key to the building is being able to look out at the land and the people, the people being represented, and then to look down at the representatives. And that it was actually that relationship which was the most important thing about the building, as opposed to any particular image, you know, the White House or Houses of Parliament or Athens or whatever it is. So just to tease that out a little bit more, because it is so important, I think, is that by not trying to design an object, we're very keen that in a contemporary context, especially in terms of Iraq, that by not approaching it as a formal play, which is actually not very Iraqi. The Iraqis love their sort of big icons, and there's a big problem in the East, particularly in places like Dubai, where the thirst for the object is overwhelming, and it's almost like people, a lot of things that we've discarded here from the 1980s is that but by not doing that, it means that it doesn't become that thing over there where those people do that thing, which is democracy. It's incredibly important that doesn't happen, that it becomes an object relationship. And also, I think it has to be not styled, not hyper-styled and not branded, because then you get this other problem of, well, there it is, the impressive object, doesn't do anything, costs a fortune, but isn't it very impressive? You know, this kind of civic pride is the wrong way, I think, to actually build civic life. It actually has to be, the parliament should be designed more like an engine rather than a statue. So it's the relationships and the platform. In this case, just to explain the parts, we've got the two great hemispheres, which are hemicycles. You've got, for example, the Houses of Parliament in London are the oppositional Westminster type, but in the European Parliament, you have what's called a hemicycle, which is more the spread that we're used to. Here in Australia, you have a sort of horseshoe, which is a bit of a compromise between the two. Interestingly, the Security Council is a pure circle. Here, we've got two hemicycles, which means that a foreign head of state can come and address everybody and doesn't have his back to anybody, but you still get as much face time as possible. And also, importantly, in Iraq, you get a lot of factions, so you can't have the two oppositional system. But we use them to, almost like a big piece of fruit, is that it then produces a very highly charged space between the two volumes. And that's actually the key place, which is like a sort of meeting place where constituents and pressure groups and MPs and the real business of democracy is done. And that's an incredibly important space. It's actually more important than the chamber in many ways, where things are rubber stamped. Then around the ring, we've got this circle of monumental brise soleil, which talks about the really strong Iraqi sun, but also means that these hoops of walkways around it means you can literally walk around the building in its entirety, looking down into the chamber, looking down into the meeting area, and then back out to the plaza, to Iraq, and so on. So here's the main approach, and the thing that we were trying to do here is, once again, not to achieve a facade as such, but we wanted the public to be able to inhabit the facade, which they can do. They can come out into the brise soleil, and what you can see there is it effectively animates. It's a framework. It's not a complete thing. The architecture just sort of finishes here, but the actual experience is way over there. You have people. It's almost like we hope that the public would almost ornament the facade by occupying it. And why a circle? We never use circles normally. I think they're incredibly powerful geometry. They usually get the better of the designer, whoever's foolish enough to use them. It came out quite late in the process for us, and I was very hesitant to use it at first, but it's turned out to work very well. But the reasons that we wanted to use it is that if you travel in Iraq at all, the monuments there, like Samarra, the mosque in Samarra, and the ziggurat in they have this, to my mind, the power of the Iraqi monuments is their simplicity. They're just these enormous, heavy objects sitting on the ground in a desert with this big blue sky, and I think the power is actually in its simplicity. So we wanted something that's not cantilevering, it's not being too clever, it's not hiding behind, you live by montage, you die by montage. There's sort of it's sort of a broken down type of aesthetic. We actually wanted something quite simple, which would then be occupied, and the occupation would really make it. So here, a simple geometry which is acting like a filter, which is nevertheless very porous. It's actually, circles are fantastic for coordinating convergent axes. We wanted there not to be a back or a front to the building, so that it is in effect, yes, it's working well on site, but it's actually facing all parts of Iraq. And also, because the hemicycles themselves are of a circular geometry, it's actually telling you something about the interior of the building and its function. It's the big sections. And the interior, we were hoping then that in terms of the internals, I won't show too many of these, but this is one of the great walkways around the edge where we hoped that the monumentality of it and the simplicity of it would then generate quite a lot of informality around its feet, about sort of clutter and debris. We were hoping there'd be carpets and chairs and people haggling and arguing and so on, and doing the business of Parliament all the way around the edge of these monumental brise-soleil fins. The Federal Council is like its own volume, and unlike the Parliament, I think the House of Representatives becomes special because it's a circle. Nothing tells you it's going to be a circle, whereas the Federal Council is actually embedded like the mosque almost into the fabric and then slid back so that its plaza is actually the same volume as its solid, and it takes the same language on its facade but plays a sort of secondary role to the House of Representatives. And then at night, instead of it shading from the sign, it would actually become a kind of lantern and would actually light the plaza inside it. Just very quickly to finish, this is some things that I literally took photos of just as I left London, is that we're doing some experiments. I don't call them artworks, they're more like things. On the left there's a artist called Nedim Kufi who's come over from Iraq, and he's in the studio messing around. And he's some of his friends, rather tragically, has these photographs of friends and people that he knows who are murdered or missing. And he's got those portraits, and he actually knows exactly the footprint of their houses. So we're making these funny things, which is like a void of the footprint of the house. And in the spirit of the empty niche in architecture, in classical architecture, which talks about loss, it's sort of imprint and depression. And there's something about when you lie it on the table like this, it becomes a bit like a grave, but it's when you then put them on a wall, they become almost like portraits. But I think I just wanted to end on that note, that we do these sort of explorations. We're sort of interested in how these absent things are made present in some way. What does that mean to do that? How would you build that? These are all sort of unasked questions. So we often play with things like this to find a language which would then find its home in a project here or there. But I think it's kind of fitting to end with the Iraqis themselves. Thank you.
So we've got time to take a few questions from the audience. There's a couple of roving microphones coming around. If you want to put your hand up, get their attention. I might kick things off while we're waiting. That was a really moving presentation, Peter. Thank you. I got a sense of this relationship between what you call the invisible ancient and the reinvention, the constant reinvention of the city. Mm-hmm. And when you kind of showed the winning scheme for the Medina, that was almost shocking to see this kind of catastrophic monumental object. And I wondered if there's a difference between the Iraqi people's sense of place in that sort of invisible ancientness, yes, and the decision makers.
That's a good question. There's a huge battle to be won there in a way, because their living standards have been so low for so long that they look at somewhere like Dubai and see it as the goal. So the reason that architecture is a bit unprofessional for me to show their work like that, but it's more as an example really, that to decimate all of that heritage, which they just see as a kind of slum, is not only acceptable to them but completely desirable, because what they want, what they see, is just an uplift in living standards. They haven't computed the experience of the Chinese, for example, where in China they've sort of wiped out all these things, and now that they have sufficient development to understand the folly of that, are now recreating fake versions of their old downtown, which are now completely mobbed. You know, the Iraqis are about to make that complete mistake again, and I think there's a real tragedy potentially going to happen where what's happened in Europe, of course, after the Second World War, so much of the development of the 60s and 70s did more damage than the bombing itself, but there's been a huge period of learning following that, and now there are a lot of methods and approaches and people working and thinking since all that time, which unfortunately the Arab world has no interest at all in looking at. It's also a language barrier as well. Unless it's in Arabic, no one listens. It's quite incredible. So there's a, you know, there's an education issue, and I don't mean education in terms of being illiterate, but in terms of learning cities, urban learning, I would call it.
Do we have a question from the audience yet?
Thanks, Peter. It was really fantastic lecture and extremely coherent and it'll take some time to kind of process. There was one comment that I'd like to ask you about, because it's the only part of the lecture that I was a bit puzzled by. It was the beginning when you said that you used more of urban design strategies than architectural. I found myself, you know, like really confronted with architecture at its most pure essence, you know, and I'd like to know what is it exactly that you meant with that, you know, because
Well, what I meant is that to take the Cadmea project, for example, we would be more than happy for other architects to come with us. Like a lot of the parts of the scheme that I showed you, I think could be done by many architects and done very well, and that would be no threat to the design. In fact, it might make it better. I mean, the last thing I want to do is do this huge megastructure which becomes boring, you know, that maybe I think is good, then I die, and then for the next 50 years everyone lives with it. So again, this is something that I think we've learned from the 70s, is that I know that there's a kind of voguish re-interest in the megastructure, but it's still a dangerous type. And we are more interested, I think, in the metaphor of the city, because the way cities work is that people are doing different things, but the city still hangs together as a piece. So I see no reason why that can't be adopted as a way of practice. So similarly on the Parliament, I think that we would like to set out some important things, but what you just saw, I think, is really a starting point. I think that fabric that we're talking about, I could see all sorts of things happening in there, which would involve other architects and other voices, and that would be a good thing. I don't know if that answers your question though, Lewis.
Absolutely, but
okay.
I still believe it is really a condition of architecture that actually allows all those other architects also to participate. You know,
I have this constant issue, I think, with names, you know, where I'm doing architecture, I'm doing urban design, and it is actually almost the biggest problem. I think the reason that we were able to unlock that issue about Cadmea was because no planner could have ever done that. Not that there's anything wrong with planning at all. I think it's a very interesting topic. It's much more politically engaged than most architects and socially engaged. But because they don't look at things at the small scale, there is no way that they could have done a study on a house, for example, and then understood what that could mean on the scale of a city. So I still think architects are in a fantastic place to benefit most from that multidisciplinary thinking. Here comes a tough one.
Firstly, it's fantastic seeing ideas at work in such a difficult part of the world, and you're to be commended for that. The reality about the difficulty about changing cities is very often not the ideas, but how things are delivered.
It's not the what, sorry?
There's not the ideas themselves. It's how they're delivered.
Yes.
And who are your champions within that extraordinary fragmented structure, I imagine, politically fragmented.
Yes.
So how on earth do you position things? Because you're juggling, it seems to me, remarkable analysis with an understanding of complexity and scale, hankering after revealing some of the guiding DNA that you can see. And how do you persuade people to actually move ahead and utilise that?
I rant. It's incredibly difficult. I think you have to take a broader view. Okay, the material that you've seen has been shown very infrequently. The last time I showed it was in Baghdad itself. That was with the specific purpose to invite as many engineers from the state and the leading academics and get some conversation going. Because basically, if you arrive at the context of a meeting and expect that your ideas are going to win the day, completely forget it. You need to build a compost, basically, of understanding from which these things can grow. So that is tough, and that is also doing a lot of unpaid work, and that is also being realistic as well. Like, a lot of the people in the administration are not a classy bunch. They've got there through really tough times. They're there for reasons, probably not very good reasons. And there's just there's also just the logistics of the city. It reminds me, when you fly to Europe or somewhere like that, and you're up at whatever it is, 30,000 feet, and you look down over the Middle East, and you see this sort of sandy, remote sort of thing, and you look down and think, God, I wonder what horrible sort of life is going on down there. And then the plane starts to descend, and it has this habit, I think, Iraq, of bringing up the big questions in you. You start to think, what the hell am I doing going to Iraq? Why is this happening? And to address your question, what are you going to do if you have interests and aspirations that are above a house, for example, and you're serious about cities? Pushing street trees around in rubbish bins in Iraq as urban design just doesn't cut it. And so you need to be in the third world, and that means tangoing with these difficult problems. And you just got to do it. I think you have to decide before you get on the plane. It's never a direct route.
There's one up the back. Yep. Hi.
I just had a question just about just your thoughts on how the building will function once it is an operational building, and that certainly from my experiences visiting Westminster Palace and also the Capitol building in the United States, almost invariably government buildings, maybe in the modern era, but they tend to become locked down like a fortress over time, which is in direct opposition to the beauty of your building. Yeah. Did you have to consider that security issue in your design brief? How does that work?
It's a really good point. There's a contradiction in the design, which we're very upfront about as well, is that you're designing it using the metaphor of Medina, but it's a completely high security island, citadel. So there's a huge contradiction there. Although it's not actually. The more you look at the city, you get these floating pieces all around it. But there's all the logistical parts. We worked out a very good approach with the engineers, whereby the complex itself would have a fleet of small vans which would service the entire complex and never leave the complex. So the large trucks which actually supply and are capable of carrying the really large explosives, they actually have to go through a huge security checkpoint and then unload their entire goods into this small dedicated fleet. And then that dedicated fleet is, if you like, a parliament vetted fleet. And that actually it's the vehicle bombs that are the real problem. So some techniques like that help a lot. The other thing is that I think by taking an urban approach rather than the iconic styled lump approach means that we're able to have security onion skins around the buildings which can move quite easily and are also easier to put in place. If you go to the styled iconic lump, you end up with security doors going down passages, whereas all we need to do is actually means that the public space only goes so far. For example, around the House of Representatives buildings, it looks incredibly open, but as a member of the public, you can actually only get to certain levels, and you can go anywhere on that level, but you actually can't then access some of the other levels. So basically, you use your ingenuity as an architect, and this is where I think the architect can really bring something to the table, because the structural engineer or the security engineer, they'll just be thinking fairly narrowly about the bomb or the person to be attacked and so on, but you can actually use the building and the approach to the urbanism to solve a lot of these problems, which are normally solved with guards, gates, guns, and so on.
Any more questions from the floor? Can I ask another one?
Shoot. No, don't.
Just following on from Michael's comment, actually, it's obviously a courageous effort to create architecture anywhere, in any environment, to pursue an idea. But Iraq, what motivates you to work in Iraq?
Oh.
What drives you to be there?
Well, it was what I was just saying earlier, but it was also an accident. I don't know about the rest of you, but I find the most important things that happen in my life are completely accidental. I did spend, in about 2009, we saw the way things were going in the UK, and we decided to reduce the size of our office radically, and then I used that money to wander around in the Middle East for a long time, as opposed to thinking that you can do a sort of trade mission, and go in and win a job in 2 weeks. And I literally spent a couple of years wandering around there. I thought that we would end up working in Qatar, in Doha. I'm really glad we're not, actually. But I learnt a lot about Arabic cities while spending time there. But it was the thing that turned us to Iraq was I was interesting. It was the University of Westminster. I was doing some teaching there, and I was marking some students' work, and some of them turned out to be Iraqi, and I got talking to them, and they were saying, you should really consider looking at Iraqi. There's lots of things that you'd be interested in, and they would be interested in you. I just thought they wanted high marks, but but I kept up with them over the years, and finally they started bringing some Iraqis over to London, and I would meet with them, and we really got on, and then we slowly decided to start doing a competition, and then there was, of course, the penny dropping moment where I thought, well, if we're going to enter this competition and we get anywhere with this competition, it means I have to actually go there. So this is that, and then we decided to do it, and so it sort of happened pretty organically and unintentionally over a period of about 5 years, I think.
Are you able to share where the competition is at this stage?
Sure. It's there's been a lot of controversy, of course. We found out the results in August. We were incredibly happy, of course, to win a blind competition of such a scale, and it's also just such a nice thing to win a blind competition because it's just about the ideas. I was talking to Piers Goff, actually, in London, who was on the jury, and he said they thought we were some fashionable Swiss architect or Italians, and it turned out we were just up the road in London. They had no idea who we were, and we had no idea who they were either until about 6 months after the decision. But of course, since then there's been a lot of press. Zaha is very annoyed that she lost the competition. I'm not her favourite person right now. I think that I think not least is that I think they are brilliant architects in their own way. I think that we take an incredibly different view, and in a way we represent different strands of the profession in that she is into branded icons that have a globalised reach and can be recognised and act as the stalking horses for the regeneration of cities as a whole, and that's that sort of approach. And we don't take that approach, and I think that it's short-termism, and I also think that practically, actually, I just don't think it works. In somewhere like Iraq, I think it's a madness to do something like that. But again, we have what I call the Dubai factor. There's a hunger for bling and so on that is pretty insatiable. We are not currently optimistic that we will get the commission. We think that Zaha will move on it, or that elements within the Iraqi authorities will win out, and they will be after this more kind of internationalised icon. But we hope that's not the case. But meanwhile, we're pursuing projects like Cadmea and the UN housing, which I haven't been able to show you, which we're just as interested in. So we're lucky actually to have a few projects. But it's I think if you take us and Zaha actually out of the equation, there's a very interesting moment going on in the profession about, historically it's always been the establishment and the young Turks and the avant-garde, and what you're seeing here is the people that awarded us the prize are actually leading figures of the establishment, and that what I think Zaha or those sort of architects have done is bypass that whole tradition. I'm not necessarily saying it's a great tradition, but that's what appears to be happening, and going for the commercial option. So it's the logic of the Nike trainer and the Louis Vuitton and so on. So it's actually a commercial thing, and I think there's a bit of a wake-up call to be had, is that the internal conversation, architects talking to other architects about architecture, is actually getting swept off the table in some instances, and there's now, if you like, a conversation going on between iconic sort of type architects talking directly to politicians and the public, and that's something we need to all wake up and have a look at, because that's a weakness in the traditional dialogue, I think.
There's a lot of weight in that kind of iconic capital A architect voice, isn't there?
I think though that works, say, for an art centre or whatever. I think it's very interesting when you do that for a parliament. Like when you start to brand a primary instrument of state, you know, it's like looking at an aircraft carrier and going, oh, Louis Vuitton. You know? And it's like a deeply bizarre thing to do, I think, or a whole hospital network and go, I really like your Gucci hospital. You know, I just think it's just really strange. But I think the things that architects need to look at, though, is that there's been a disengagement because of sort of silly archibabble and sort of a narcissistic approach to good taste, which has actually removed the profession from a much more direct relationship to the market and also a direct relationship to popular culture, which needs to be addressed, I think. And that's what we're seeing, I think, in this Parliament competition.
I think we're going to have to continue this in a whole other lecture on
No
that topic. Can you please join me in thanking Peter Besley? Thank you all for joining us tonight. Just a reminder, next week we welcome Owen and Vokes and Peters. And if you can remember to RSVP on Eventbrite for that event. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time.